Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Frank Klotz. I am the Senior Fellow for Strategic Studies and Arms Control here at the Council on Foreign Relations. And it's my honor and privilege to welcome the NASA Administrator, Charles Bolden, to speak to us this afternoon at this conference. Now, a couple housekeeping things first. As a reminder, this session is on the record, which means that you're free to quote anything that you hear during this afternoon's event. I would, however, kindly ask you to please turn off, and I mean all the way off, not just on vibrate, your cell phones, Blackberries, and any other wireless devices. And the reason I ask you to do that is we have very, very sensitive audio-visual equipment in this room, and it can and will interfere with that. So if you'd be so kind as to do that, that would be very helpful. Now, there's a copy of Administrator Bolden's biography in your program, and you can read the details of a very long and impressive career in government service. But allow me to just mention a couple of the highlights. Administrator Bolden is the 12th administrator of the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, and in this capacity, he leads the NASA team and manages its resources to advance the agency's missions and goals. Administrator Bolden was born and raised in Columbia, South Carolina. Yes. He graduated from the U.S. Naval Academy, which is not far from here, in Annapolis, Maryland, in 1968 with a degree in electrical engineering. He was subsequently commissioned a second lieutenant in the United States Marine Corps. He subsequently became a naval aviator and flew more than 100 combat missions in Southeast Asia. After earning a master's degree in systems management from the University of Southern California, he became a Navy test pilot and then an astronaut. He traveled into space on 4 separate occasions aboard the space shuttle, and he commanded 2 of those missions. And his flights included such important milestones as the deployment of the Hubble Space Telescope. He returned to the Marine Corps in 1994 and served in a series of high-level command positions, retiring as a 2-star general in 2003. Now, what we'll do this afternoon is Administrator Bolden and I will have a conversation for the first part of the program, and then we'll turn to you, the audience, for any questions that you may have. So as we're going through this, you might start formulating a few in mind. Let me start with the first one. Administrator Bolden, you've had a truly extraordinary and exciting life. An Annapolis graduate, Marine Corps aviator, astronaut with 4 trips into space, now head of NASA. That's pretty cool.
It's pretty cool.
So as you look back on that, how did all this happen? To what do you attribute your success in life?
Before I answer the question, let me thank the council for the invitation to be here. This is an incredible group. Haven't had a chance to talk to a lot of you, but I hopefully will get your questions. And thank you, General Klotz, for moderating. Let me start with where it started. I think I owe everything to my mom and dad because they were both career educators in South Carolina. I grew up in the segregated South, and that does make a difference. But my mom and dad had known each other forever almost. Went to high school together and then went to Johnson C. Smith University in Charlotte, North Carolina. Came out in the class of 1940 and went right back to Columbia and started teaching. And a year later, my dad was drafted in the Army, and like all people who went in the Army back then, came home when the war was over. But he came right back to teaching. I had an opportunity throughout my life, my early life, to quote unquote work for both of them because my mother started as an elementary school librarian, then junior high, and then high school. And when I went through junior high school, I was one of her library assistants. You don't want to do that, okay? And that was in the days when you wrap books in newspapers in the summertime because the library didn't stay open in the summer. It closed when schools closed. And then when I got to high school, my father was a very well-known, very successful high school football coach in South Carolina, and so I ended up playing football for my father. I was not very good. I was the second string quarterback, and I was really little, but I made the team, and I never played at home. He knew my mother was always in the stands, and he did not want her to have to undergo the abuse, the verbal abuse that always seemed to go with a coach's wife if they had a kid playing. And so I never played at home. And then the Naval Academy was an incredible influence on my life. Two things I said I would not do when I left high school in South Carolina. I would not go in the Marine Corps coming out of the Naval Academy, and I would not fly airplanes because that was inherently dangerous. And it was because of people I met, a person in particular, Major John Riley Love, my very first company officer at the Naval Academy, who impressed me like my dad, very tough but fair, that I decided I was going to go in the Marine Corps. And then kind of stumbling around in the basic school, decided I did not like crawling around in the mud. My wife recommended we go to Pensacola, Florida, and I learned very early that usually when your wife says something, then she's right, so go, and I did. And then the rest is sort of history. I really paid attention to people around me, people who influenced my life, became a test pilot, and then subsequently went to the space program.
So what's it like to be in space?
Awesome. It's it's a bit. There is no good word to describe it, and probably the awesome is the best word. Awe connotes something that kind of is indescribable. When religious people talk about God or Allah or whatever, they frequently talk about how awesome that entity is. And so that's about it. The two things that are indelibly imprinted on you are the physical experience of being weightless, of gravity having been overcome. You're still in a gravity environment, but the shuttle's going around, or the International Space Station, or any spacecraft is going around Earth so fast that it equalizes the force of gravity, and so you float. That's incredible, because instantly when the main engine's cut off and you know you're in space, you know it by several different things. One, you start floating up against your straps, but the other thing is your head starts to hurt. And it's because fluid in your lower extremities, the fluids seek equilibrium, so you have all this excess fluid in your head that you don't need, and you learn how to take care of that real quick. You go to the bathroom, and over the first couple of days, you urinate out about 2 liters of fluid that the body doesn't need there. The second incredible part of the awesomeness is just using these cameras that God gave you to look at Earth from that vantage point, and it is awesome. It's hard. You're inside a vehicle, so it's like being in this room, except for the fact that gravity is overcome. So your eyes can still see colors. So Earth, in all its magnificence, every single continent has deserts, and every single desert of every single continent is unique. The rich red desert in the middle of Australia, the blonde desert, the Sahara in Africa, and everything else. You don't see buildings, with a very few exceptions. No evidence that people live here, except for the long linear features that turn out to be roads and bridges and runways. And I tell people frequently, if you were Martian and you were on your way to this planet and you got to about 400 miles or so, you'd probably turn around and go back and say, nope, nobody there, so let's go somewhere else. So that's what it's like.
Fascinating, fascinating. Well, you had 4 flights on the shuttle, but the shuttle was retired in 2011. And since then, the United States has not had the ability to launch American astronauts from American soil on American rockets. Yet we still have astronauts on the International Space Station. So how do we get our astronauts into space right now, and are we going to change how we
are
send people
going
into
to
space?
change, and we're not changing fast enough. If you're interested in space at all, and I can't say that. I can't tell you to go talk to your congressmen and women, but I'd go talk to my congressman or woman if you're really interested in it. The president, when he came in, decided that he was going to do what almost every president in modern time has said, and that's to try to turn to a commercially available capability to get both cargo and crews into space. So we have 2 programs. One is called the Commercial Cargo Program. Commercial Resupply Services now is its formal name. Some of you know about SpaceX and their Falcon launch vehicle and the Dragon module. SpaceX has already taken 2 commercial flights to the International Space Station with cargo. We have SpaceX, Boeing, and a company called Sierra Nevada out of Colorado that are vying to produce the human-rated vehicles to take our astronauts. After the Columbia accident, we had astronauts on board the International Space Station, no way to get up there and get them, and no way to get them up there when we needed to replace them. And we turned to a longtime partner, the Russians, and they fly Soyuz, which is a 3-person capsule. And so we started relying on the Russians to supply crews to the International Space Station. When we resumed flying on shuttle, because the Columbia Accident Investigation Board recommended and the president accepted the recommendations that we phase the shuttle out by 2010 when construction of the station was complete, and that we turned to producing a commercial capability to get there. And that's essentially what we did. President Obama gave us an extra year, allowed us to add 2 flights to give us some, because commercial crew was not coming along as rapidly as we had hoped. So he gave us some, I guess, to buy some insurance by putting additional supplies on the International Space Station with 2 extra shuttle flights, and then we phased it out in July of 2011.
So the commercial crew concept will get our astronauts and up to the International Space Station. Now, what about beyond so-called low Earth orbit, out to the moons, the asteroids, Mars?
Humans have always wanted to go to Mars, believe it or not. And some of you who read science fiction and stuff, the spacey science fiction stories were always about, I saw Buck Rogers when I was a kid, and you know, Buck would go out and get in his spaceship and he'd be on his way to Mars. And I always dreamed about somebody doing that. But our job now in NASA is to try to produce an American capability that will be conducted with international partnerships to explore beyond low Earth orbit. And I, very simplistically, I look at it as access to space and then exploration of the universe. NASA is no longer in the access to space business. SpaceX and now a company called Orbital Sciences, Orbital's on the verge of demonstrating their ability to do it, but SpaceX has demonstrated the ability of private enterprises to provide access to space. The exploration is too much for any private enterprise to undertake because exploration is expensive. Exploration is very risky, and there are things that need to be done that I think only a nation should do, a great nation. And since we're the greatest nation on Earth today, I think it's incumbent upon us to try to bring in potential partners and help and allow them to go with us as we explore beyond low Earth orbit. We have 2 vehicles. The launch vehicle is called a Space Launch System or Heavy Lift Launch Vehicle. The crew module looks somewhat like an Apollo spacecraft or a Soyuz, is called Orion. And Orion has the capability of carrying a crew of 7, but we'll carry probably 4 on a deep space mission. The first one we're going to try to do will come about 2021 when we hopefully will rendezvous with an asteroid that we've moved from its normal orbit and put it in a stable orbit position around the moon, and we'll send astronauts to the asteroid in preparation for going on to Mars in the 2030s.
Well, I wonder if I could follow up. You said that, you know, space flight can be risky.
Is risky.
Is risky. And NASA's had great success with interplanetary probes. You've got Curiosity rover on the surface of Mars now, sending back pictures and scientific data. Is it really necessary for humans to go into space to explore? Why can't we just rely upon increasingly sophisticated robotic craft to do that?
We should do both. We should increasingly add to the sophistication of robotic vehicles, as we have demonstrated, for example, with Curiosity. And I'll tell you a story from John Grunsfeld is a former astronaut. He's the head of our Science Mission Directorate at NASA now, and we were doing some press availabilities on the morning that Curiosity landed on Mars. We were out in Pasadena, California. And I was doing a press conference with John, and John said, okay, I have a prediction. And I went, oh, this is not good. You know, what is he going to say? And he said, my prediction is Curiosity will discover nothing. And I went, he said, it will discover nothing because it's a robot. Humans back here on Earth who takes the data that it provides will make the discoveries. When we went to the moon, we used robotic vehicles for the astronauts to get around and everything. They were very highly trained. We had lots of ideas about where we would find things, but it was in the pieces of rock that geologists and other scientists who were astronauts just happened to see to say, okay, they didn't tell me to bring that one back, but that looks really interesting. And so the human can do what a robot cannot yet do. And I'm not saying robots won't be able to do it someday, but today they can't reason. They don't have a way to look around from where they are told to look and discover that something's pretty interesting over there. And I'm going to pick that up and put it in my pocket and take it back home, and then we'll look at it later. So I think it's the combination, the collaboration between humans and robots that are going to allow us to discover even more than we've ever done before in this universe.
I've heard it said that a human being might be able to do as much exploration in a few days or a week as one of these probes on a planet can do in months.
And I'm not a scientist, but I have had it said to me on many occasions that in the 6 brief forays to the surface of the moon with the Apollo program, the discoveries that have come to date, and we still have just an abundance of lunar samples to be analyzed, that what was done in those 6 missions to the moon eclipsed what could have been done by robotic explorers in a lifetime. We really think that, you know, Curiosity is going to spend potentially 10 years roaming the surface of Mars. It'll be joined hopefully by a sister spacecraft in 2020 that'll go to another part of the planet, always searching for signs of life. That's the real reason we're there. But when we get astronauts on the surface, I think the volume of information that we gain will just marginally increase, because you have a human there who can assess real time what a robotic vehicle can't do right now.
Well, we've gone to the moon, we've gone to Mars. I wonder if I could bring you back again to low Earth orbit. We have this international, and I stress given the setting where we are, International Space Station. Could you maybe describe for our audience what goes on the International Space
Sure
Station?
can. The International Space Station, my definition, is the United Nations in orbit. We have had, there are 15 different nations who contribute materially to the International Space Station. 5 partners, I'll get them right here. The United States, I always forget to name the United States. The United States, Japan, Russia, Canada, and the European Space Agency. Thank you there, Anthony. The European Space Agency is perhaps the biggest, most diverse partner, because they have 20 some odd member nations, 19 of which, or 15 of which, actually participate materially in the International Space Station. We have vehicles that can go and carry cargo from Japan, from Europe, from Russia, now from the United States. We had a mission where there were a total of 15 astronauts on board at one time, and 3 different cargo vehicles from 3 different entities. And it was really, it was truly like the United Nations at work. We do about 400 experiments a year on the International Space Station, everything ranging from human research program, materials processing, things like pharmaceuticals research. We now have instruments on board that do everything from astrophysics with the alpha magnetic spectrometer that is sort of like a space-borne superconducting super collider that's in CERN in Switzerland. We have put several Earth observation instruments on the International Space Station, a solar instrument that's monitoring the sun from the International Space Station. And just recently, we miniaturized a program that we work in conjunction with multiple nations around the world through the U.S. Agency for International Development, a program called SERVIR. S-E-R-V-I-R means to serve in Spanish. And it provides 30 years worth of archived Earth science data plus real-time data from about 10 orbiting satellites, provides it to 3 regions of the world, Central and South America out of Panama, East Africa out of Nairobi, Kenya, and most recently the Himalayan region nations out of Kathmandu, Nepal. We work with scientists from these nations and help them look at issues pertaining to Earth and problems that we have, disaster monitoring and management. For example, in East Africa, when Mike O'Brien and I, Obi runs our international program, when he and I visited Nairobi, Kenya, the center there, they actually had brought in scientists from 15 member nations of this environmental center, and our scientists were helping them learn how to develop drought and flood models simultaneously. Right now, people, they suffer from drought, they repair stuff, and then what they do makes it worse when the flood comes. What we were trying to do was help them look at the data, use it such that the drought and the flood models would be collaborative with each other and would serve the purposes without having to go back and forth the way people frequently do. So it is the most incredible orbiting laboratory. It provides us a place where humans can do something that cannot be done anywhere else in the world. It's a microgravity, not zero G, because there is no true zero G, but it's a microgravity environment that speeds up the life processes in the human body. You age when you go to space. You don't get younger. I know that's what I heard when I was growing up, but you've got to travel pretty close to the speed of light, you know, to even have a hope of that. You age much quicker. We study things like osteoporosis. We can look at data that helps us understand osteoporosis in a matter of days and weeks, whereas it used to be months in bed rest studies and the like. We're learning about the impact of the fluid shifts on the brain that affects astronauts in their vision, a lot of other things. So it's quite an interesting place to be.
A couple of months ago, all the news outlets had pictures of this meteor coming in near Chelyabinsk in Siberia in Russia. A lot of dash cams, I guess, on Russian cars picked it up, which raised a lot of concern about, you know, maybe larger objects, asteroids coming crashing into Earth. Is there any way we as a nation or as an international community can protect ourselves against the threat of very large chunks of something coming from outer space and crashing into the Earth?
I hate to break the news, but today, no. As was demonstrated in Chelyabinsk. And some of you who remember that day know that the world was in just anxious anticipation of the near passage to Earth of a big asteroid. That's name was 2012 DA14. And when you talk about international collaboration, 2012 DA14 was initially identified, initially discovered by, I am told, amateur astronomers in Spain, who fed that data to something called the Small Planets Center, and then it was processed, and so we were able to predict the day and time of it wasn't its closest passage to Earth, because it actually had been closer to Earth before. But everybody was paying attention to that, and then out of the other direction, out of the sun, comes this big meteor that turned into a meteorite, essentially, because it had a big airburst over Chelyabinsk, and you know, we had thousands of people who were injured, debris all over the place, and a shock. And it called attention to the fact that we don't have anything to do to protect the planet. One of NASA's charges in the National Space Policy, along with the Department of Defense, our responsibility is to develop technologies that will enable us to detect all Earth-threatening near-Earth objects, or asteroids is what they mean. We can detect big ones, the civilization-destroying ones, but we can't do anything with it once we detect it. What we need to do is better identify the smaller ones that will get through, like the one that hit Chelyabinsk. And so President Obama, since coming into office, has steadily increased the budget for asteroid identification and characterization from $2 billion to $2 million to $40 million in this present budget. So a factor of 10 over the last 5 years. We have to be able to identify and then characterize. You've heard of an asteroid retrieval mission that NASA's now talking about. We've been working on this for much longer than you would believe, but in earnest for since April 15th, 2010, when the president delivered a message to the nation down at the Kennedy Space Center, and he said, NASA is going to send humans to an asteroid by 2025 and to Mars in the 2030s. And so we started working, because that was a tall order. You know, we found that technologically we don't quite know how to do that just yet, but we're almost there. Financially, it's really hard, because most asteroids that end up coming toward Earth are in the asteroid belt that's between Mars and Jupiter. So you're talking about a long trip to an asteroid for a human. So we started looking for some innovative ways to do what the president said. And we said, okay, if we can't get to the asteroid soon, why don't we bring the asteroid to us? And that's conceptually what we're going to try to do. A couple of things. We have 3 candidate asteroids already, but you want to find one that is small enough for us to manipulate that even if we screw it up and cause it to veer toward Earth, where it is eventually going to come into the atmosphere, it doesn't get all the way through. And that's why we picked a 7 to 10 meter asteroid. The other thing is it needs to be something that is already headed this way so that we can kind of rendezvous with it with a robotic vehicle and use solar electric propulsion to kind of steer it toward what we call a stable orbit rendezvous around the moon, a point where when we get it there, it'll stay there for 100 years. And that'll give us an opportunity to then take astronaut crews using the heavy lift launch vehicle in Orion to rendezvous with the asteroid in stable orbit around the moon and then do the types of studies that we think. What's critically important about the concept, the strategy is whether we are able to move the asteroid to a stable orbit point or not. If we show that we can move it a millimeter, then that is the beginnings of the ability to protect Earth from the threat of an asteroid. You know, what you want to do is, when I talk about identification and characterization, you want to find out as early as possible what is it that is going to threaten Earth. And then you want to try to say, can we move it? Can we deflect it at all? How many of you play basketball? Okay. You know, what's your coach tell you? You know, you don't want to wait until this big, tall guy who's, you know, you're trying to guard goes up to get his shot off. You're probably not going to get up, or girl, you're probably not going to get up there anyway. You got to get them early, you know, stop them from going up and knock the ball out of something. That's what we want to do with an Earth-threatening asteroid. We want to try to identify it and find it as early as possible and then go out, meet it, and try to deflect it ever so slightly and make it go away from Earth.
I understand we also hope to learn things about the origin of the solar system and of Earth by what we actually see on the asteroid.
One of the things that scientists tell me, I keep emphasizing, I am not a planetary scientist, but asteroids harbor much the same kind of information that we want to find when we go to the surface of Mars. The origins of the universe, because asteroids are frequently pieces of planets that were formed in the earliest of time. And as I said, they're in belts. The biggest one is kind of between Mars and Jupiter, but some of them have, I call them funky orbits, because they come from way out and then they come in between Earth and the sun. Those are bad, because the ones that are out in big orbits, whether circular or otherwise, but are outside Earth's orbit, we don't worry about them because they're going to stay out there and they can do whatever they want to do and we don't care. There are very few that are inside Earth's orbit. We don't really care about them either because they're not going to bother. It's the ones that are in these oblong orbits that go through Earth's orbit of the sun, because sooner or later, it may be 100 years, it may be 1,000 years, but sooner or later, it's going to cross Earth's orbit, and on a bad day, they're going to get to the same place at the same time. So that's what we're trying to avoid.
Well, let's turn to the audience now to see if they have any questions they'd like to ask. Beforehand, let me tell you, we have microphones positioned all the way around the room. So please wait for the microphone, and then when you get the microphone, speak directly into it. I'd ask you to please stand so we can see you from up here. State your name and where you're from. And for the sake of everyone else in the audience, I'd ask you to keep your questions and comments crisp, concise, and to the point so we can have as many participants as possible have a chance to speak. This gentleman in the back of the room, very back of the room.
Good afternoon, Administrator Bolden. Thank you very much for being here. My name's Darren Johnson. I work with the State Department, and I am a self-professed Trekkie. And so I was just curious what your thoughts are about the future of human exploration in space. Do you see space colonies? Do you see in the next centuries exploration? Will we have a Starfleet?
You said Derek?
Darren.
Darren. All of the above. Seriously, you know, as I said, when I was younger than almost anybody in here, I think, I used to go to the movies on Saturday, and I would watch two things. One, my favorite cowboy back then was a guy named Lash LaRue, and nobody's ever heard of Lash LaRue, but he always had a big whip, and he would crack it. So that was my cowboy favorite. The Lone Ranger too, but my all-time favorite was actually Buck Rogers, who, as I said, would go, get into his starship and go somewhere. Big fan of, Star Wars, Star Trek, all of those. And I think it is possible for humans, for society to come together, work together, and have what's called the Federation, if you will, where we wander through the universe, always trying to make sure that good wins out over evil. Now, that's kind of hokey to some people, but I think there may be a possibility or a necessity for it at some time. I cite the International Space Station, and I think it's incredible that the title of this conference, is Diversity on International Affairs, because far too often when I go somewhere, there's nobody there that looks like me. There's nobody there with my background. There's nobody there that actually culturally thinks like me. And so to have a gathering like this where there are people who I think probably represent tons of cultures, lots of religions, and some but it's really important that we try to bring diverse people together, because that's when you capture the richness of ideas. But I think, the president has challenged us. The first challenge was put humans with an asteroid in 2025. We think we can do that, and we're well on the way to doing it conceptually. That's the asteroid strategy that I talked about. It's more than just a mission, though, and so it's really important for people to understand that. It is a total strategy that tries to answer the challenge from the national space policy to protect the planet. It's trying to do, as General Klotz said, help us understand more about our own universe and the very origins of humankind and our Earth and everything else, and then the ability to put humans with an asteroid. But everything is leading toward the ultimate destination for our society today. And I'm not limiting it to Mars, but for our society today, the ultimate destination is probably Mars, because it is the one planet in our solar system of 8-point-some-odd planets. If you're a Pluto person, then 9 planets, but if you're not, then it's 8. But anyway, it is the one planet that in many ways bears some resemblance to Earth, a little bit smaller, but still we think all the signs are there's an abundance of water there, most of it frozen, but the signs are that if any planet in the solar system could sustain life at any time, it's probably Mars. So that's why curiosity is there, and so I think that's why I say the answer to your question is all of the above. Yeah.
Let's go to this lady over here.
Thank you.
Oh, Mike.
It is.
Yes, so my name is Kristen Hayden. I'm
Hi,
from
Kristen.
Seattle, and I'm One World Now, which sends
Yeah.
underserved
Yeah.
after learning Chinese and Arabic. So what's interesting is, we're in the business of sending students abroad so that they will have this totally new perspective on the world when they come back. And it strikes me, and again, I'm always out there promoting study abroad, study abroad. What strikes me is that, wow, your perspective is just, from coming from space. I'm just curious if you could talk about from that point of how we often ask the young people when they come back, how has your perspective changed?
Yeah.
And how has that impacted your life? So that's my question to you is, how has that perspective, when you're talking to folks that do not have that perspective, how has your own thinking changed
Okay.
by that experience?
Yeah, let me try to make it as quickly as I can. Several things. From a faith perspective, because I profess to be a Christian. I'm not a very good one. I'm not a Bible reading, whatever else it is. I recognize a book of the Bible when somebody says it. But I grew up in the church. I started as a Presbyterian because that's what my mom and dad were. And then for a very simplistic reason, I wanted to go where there were other kids, and there weren't any in my church. So I picked the Episcopal church that had a priest that just had youth programs and stuff, and I never left after that. I wanted to be an altar boy, and I did that. People ask frequently about spiritual change. from the vantage point of space, my faith was strengthened. I wouldn't say it was radically changed at all. My perspective on Earth and our place in the universe, big thing was I became much more convinced that, boy, we are insignificant when you get right down to it. And so the insignificance of humanity is one thing. The fact that we live on a ball that is one big ocean with little pieces of land that kind of stick up in it here and there. You know, we call all the sections of that big body of water oceans and seas and stuff like that. But from the vantage point of space, it is one huge body of water with little disparate pieces of land sticking up. And so, again, you recognize that every one of these little pieces of land has a different culture and a different belief system or something on it, and yet we manage to find a way to coexist. The reason I talk about the International Space Station being a little United Nations is because the U.S. has not had enemies more visceral, if you will, than Japan and the former Soviet Union, or Japan and Russia. And yet today they are just incredibly valuable partners in this venture called the International Space Station. The marvel of the International Space Station is a module, big component called JEM, the Japanese Experiment Module. Everybody wants to go in there and work because it is state of the art. The foundation of the International Space Station is Zarya, which was a functional cargo block. It was the very first piece about which everything else was put, and that's Russian. Today we depend on the Russians for transportation, as we talked about. So, my perspective from both a faith base and just a humanity basis was changed, if you will, or at least strengthened, I think. Yeah.
This lady right here on the aisle.
Hi, my name is Jacqueline Maria, and I'm interning at CFR in New York. And my question is that in recent years, we've seen sort of an increase in territorial claims or territorial interest in the Arctic, which was previously this region that we thought was uninhabitable, unexplorable, essentially. Do you feel like this sets a precedent for territorial claims in space, or could you talk about
the asteroid mission?
Right.
It's been interesting because the night before we rolled the budget out, literally the night before, Mr. O'Brien down here and his whole office were back and forth to the State Department, and some of you who work in state may know this. All of a sudden, because nobody knows what the agencies are going to say in their budget because it's all secret. And it's pre-decisional information, and only the president is supposed to know until he makes it public on budget day. We had to go, though, and talk to other elements of the government about this proposed asteroid mission. And boy, I'll tell you, the lawyers went, oh, you can't do that. There are going to be claims that the U.S. is trying to put its flag in an asteroid, and you just can't do that. International law won't provide. But the point was, that is not the intent. Our intent is to demonstrate technology. Our intent is to try to expand our international collaboration because we cannot do this alone. So there will be any number of nations involved in it, and there is no intent for, at least not for the U.S. government, to lay claim to an asteroid. But it will be a challenge because someone, some commercial entity, and we're already working with some of them trying to provide them what we learn technologically. Someone will decide that, that's a pretty good source of income. And it also provides energy for the nation that we did not have before, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So those are things that some of you who are going to be attorneys will have to deal with.
Okay, on the aisle, right there.
I'm fascinated by the open data movement and how government and NASA in particular is leading it. I'm curating an initiative for the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation called Markets for Good, and I would like to know, and we're all about how the social sector can better improve its use of the information infrastructure. And so with respect to the data sets that you're releasing and the open data impact that can have, perhaps in this new iteration of NASA, how could that benefit us?
Well, I think what we do any day, I can't remember the actual name of the database, but there is a science and technology database that NASA maintains that has literally millions, if not tens of millions of items of data from dating all the way back to NASA's formation, even back to the days of NACA, which is NASA's predecessor, that have in open source available to anybody anywhere in the world in life science, in propulsion, you name it, anything that is not considered, that has been cleared not to violate ITAR, the International Trafficking in Arms Regulation, or any other regulations that prohibit the transfer of technical information. So once it's cleared that, it goes into our data source if it belongs to us, and it becomes accessible to anybody. Things like the data, the earth science data that's provided through Severe, absolutely incredible for pulling nations, disparate nations together that might not ordinarily talk to each other. If you look at AMS, the Alpha Magnetic Spectrometer that is presently on the International Space Station, one team of collaborators is a Chinese astrophysicist and a Taiwanese astrophysicist. Now, they probably couldn't even talk to each other, maybe, but they are collaborators on an astrophysics experiment. When Obi and I went to Kathmandu, Nepal to unveil the Severe hub there, the 8 member nations include Bhutan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, China, on and on and on, and there are scientists who come together at this environmental center, you know, on the slopes of the Himalayas to try to understand how they better protect the region and feed people and do all other kinds of things. So hopefully everything that we do, we can make it known that it is accessible, and maybe through your organization or others, make people aware that it is there.
Over there on the side, and then we'll come back here to the middle.
Hello, thank you for being here. My name is Nadine Tavera. I'm from the University of Houston, and I was born and raised in Houston, and I've had the privilege to tour the Johnson Space Center, where I learned about the lengthy training. So can you speak about the training that you underwent and how it compared to the actual experience, and maybe the surprises that came about that you had to adapt to in space?
Life in space is so much easier than training. I am a shuttle astronaut, period. So I came after Apollo, and I came before we had an International Space Station. And so 3 different eras, 3 different forms of training. For the Apollo astronauts, Mercury, Gemini, Apollo, because we didn't have a clue, much more intense attention to medical data and just trying to make sure that you had the best people. They had to be superb specimen. Not anymore. We now know that space flight normal people can do. And so it's not quite the way it was in the Mercury, Gemini, Apollo era. But with shuttle, training for a particular mission usually took, mission-specific training was a year. When you were assigned to be a crew member, you and your crew came together. The first 6 months was spent in what we call standalone training, where you really focused on the shuttle, its systems, and the experiments that you might fly. And then the second month, the final 6 months of the training, nobody really cared about you. It was all devoted to integrating the team, the ground controllers, the international partners, and other people that you would be serving. And so when you went in a simulator in the first 6 months, any malfunction that occurred, boom, you had to respond, just like you were alone in your airplane. Last 6 months, you didn't do a thing for almost any emergency before you talked to the ground and gave the ground crew an opportunity to come back and give you their assessment. And what you generally found out was they'd been looking at it for days before it even tripped the limit and caused an alarm to go off. So training for the flight was intense. We always called it disaster training. I saw 1 nominal ascent and 1 nominal entry on each of my flights, and they were the last ascent and entry simulation that you did before you went down to Florida to go launch. Everything else from day 1 was always something going wrong, and it meant everything from something very minor to something that was going to kill you, that you just, you know, eventually it wasn't intended They didn't want to expose you to the ones that were going to kill you too often, but you did have training scenarios so that you would recognize, okay, do all you can, but you're probably not going to get out of this. You know, something like one SRB igniting on the launch pad and the other one not. That's a bad day. You know, you weren't going to survive that. The chances of that happening were really, really, really slim, but you saw it, so you would know what it looked like. So flying, we almost, even on station, you almost never have an emergency that is life-threatening. Asteroids and orbital debris is probably the most life-threatening thing to astronauts on the International Space Station. And I don't know whether we had to, last night we were thinking we might have to do a debris avoidance maneuver, and we do them periodically. Station is huge. I mean, it's 1 million+ pounds, the length of a football field, and you don't want to have to move that thing if you don't have to. But there are chunks of orbital debris that come around now and then, and the only thing you can do to guarantee that the crew's going to be okay is move the station, and that's pretty involved. So you know, the crew still depends on the ground for seeing things in the volumes of data that they have. That's far more than the crew can see.
We had a question right there in the middle. You've been waiting patiently.
Hello, my name is Jasmine. I am a sophomore in high school. I'm with the International Youth Leadership Institute. And I was wondering, since we've all seen one way or another the effects of climate change in the US and on Earth, I guess, I was wondering if you've seen any trends or patterns in space that might be affiliated with the devastation of climate change.
No question. No question. The question asked earlier about nations battling for resources and the asteroid and everything else. The reason that there is so much controversy about access to resources and other things in the Arctic today is because you couldn't get in there before. The climate is changing. The glaciers are disappearing. And so now, you can go by sea across the Arctic, whereas it wasn't even thought of before. Because they can do that, then many nations are now having submarines and other kinds of things that are doing research at the ocean floor in places where we just chose not to go before because it was so hostile. You look at Earth, and I talked about your perspective changing. There are certain areas of Earth, everybody looks at Lake Chad in Central Africa as a glowing example of the change in climate, because Lake Chad used to be, decades ago, huge body of water. Today, it's just, the remnants of this great body of water where irrigation, evaporation, other things have taken water away from it. The Aral Sea in Russia, formerly the Soviet Union, all kinds of nuclear plants and other things were built around the Aral Sea. Water inlets to the Aral Sea dammed up such that now it is among the most polluted, the most dangerous places in the world. And you could see that over time from Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo right up until today. And so there is just with shuttle alone, there is a 30-year record of increasing degradation on Earth that we attribute to climate change. And we're not saying humans caused it, we're not saying anything, but when you go back and you look at, okay, how did that happen? Well, nature didn't create nuclear power plants and nuclear waste, and nature didn't put the dam in that kept fresh water from going into some of these places. So we do bear some responsibility. The combination of results of what nature has done and what humans have done is not good for the planet. Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to go way, way to the back, very last row back there.
Hello, everyone. My name is Andrea Ruiz, and currently work for an embassy here in DC and used to be in GW. So my question is a little bit more philosophical, more on the role that the government versus the private sector should play in developing this very critical technology. Technology meaning space information, analysis on climate change, etc. To what extent do you think that the government is fully necessary to have these innovations? To what extent do you think that the private sector could take over and do it itself? Can the private sector do it without the government? what do you think is the perfect balance?
Yeah, some things the private sector can and should do. Let me give you a couple of examples. The Hubble Space Telescope. I don't think any private entity could have ever produced, launched, and done the 5 servicing missions of Hubble that make it today the most extraordinary technological achievement in science, anyway, until we launched the James Webb Space Telescope. But the dissemination and analysis of information that comes from Hubble is done by a private institution called the Space Telescope Science Institute, resident on the campus of Johns Hopkins University. NASA feeds it data. We provide the communications link that allows data to come from Hubble down to the Science Institute, and some of it we process. But that's private, that's academia and industry working together. Many of the things that NASA develops, like rockets. Today we have private companies like SpaceX and Orbital who are producing rockets that go to space because they're able to go to a database that says, okay, you know, NASA learned this and that in building some of the earlier rockets, so don't do that. You know, that's not really good if you want to build a working rocket, and they have complete access to that. When you talk about something like deep space exploration, at some time, going back to Darren, okay, going back to Darren's question, when we have colonies in space and when we have the Federation, that will be at the point that private industry, academia, and just normal people like you say, you know, it's worth it for us to do that. We should take over from the government because we really have some, I don't know, altruistic reason we want to do this. You know, we should bring people together for the good of humankind. And that's when the government should step away. I doubt very seriously that it's going to be anytime soon that private entities are able to mount something like the whole asteroid mission that's a part of the strategy. We are working with private industry right now to help them build satellites and other instruments that will help us detect the types of Earth-threatening asteroids that we need to do. Because government can't do everything, we now have private entities that want to do that, and so we're providing them the technological know-how, our engineering know-how to help them do it. There's a company called B612 that's a number of entrepreneurs and former astronauts who say they're tired of waiting on the U.S. to go hunt asteroids, so they're going to do it on their own. And they contracted with a commercial company called Ball Aerospace out of Colorado, and they're building a satellite called Sentinel. And Sentinel is hopefully going to help us in identifying some of these smaller, the Earth-threatening, the civilization-threatening asteroids. They're not looking for the little ones like we are, so we got to do that on our own. But there's always going to be a collaboration, and what you have to do is determine what's the right time to hand it off. Yeah.
Okay. Let's go right here, the gentleman about 4 rows back.
It's working. Yeah, they got it.
Well, could you identify yourself and where you're from?
My name is Paulson.
Mm-hmm.
I came from New York. I'm not a scientist, but I learned a lot from the presentation. It's very fascinating. My question is more about partnerships and stakeholders. Mm-hmm. You said that the space exploration program is like the United Nations, and you mentioned 5 partners: US, Japan, EU, European Union, and Canada. And my question is, how are other countries of Africa and Latin America engaged to participate in this program, since the benefit should be affecting all the population of the world? How they participate in the program?
Great question too. And one of the first things that President Obama directed, he didn't ask, directed us to do was expand our reach around the world to what we call non-traditional partners. And some of you may remember, those of you who do this kind of stuff for a living may remember that Mr. O'Brien and I got in trouble in early execution of the program because, you know, we traveled a lot of different places looking for people and nations who would not otherwise be able to enter the family of spacefaring nations. Either they couldn't afford it or they didn't have the technological background or whatever. And so today we have agreements with literally hundreds of countries around the world in things as major as the alpha magnetic spectrometer, which is an astrophysics experiment, to something like GLOBE. And GLOBE is an education program that allows a student anywhere in the world where the program resides to go outside, take a temperature or humidity reading or something, go inside, log on to the GLOBE website, put their data in, and then they're now part of an international collaborative on studying the climate and everything else. But that's what we do. We're always out looking for what we call non-traditional partners. We just spent 4 days in Hanoi, Vietnam, not very long ago, because the Vietnamese are very interested. They right now are purchasing satellites, Earth science satellites from other nations, but they'd like to be able to build their own. I mentioned going to Kathmandu, Nepal. So NASA's reach is all over, trying to fulfill the president's direction that we expand our outreach to non-traditional partners. The station itself, the International Space Station, I'll make one correction. It's not the EU, it's the European Space Agency, and that may not sound like a big deal. It is to them. So, you know, the European Space Agency actually, well, anyway, but that's the space arm of the European nations. So those 5 partners that I mentioned are signatories in a treaty for the International Space Station. So we are not looking for additional partners, because that would mean opening up the treaty, renegotiating, and everything else. But every nation, every member agency is encouraged to go out and find partners with whom we can collaborate. And so the U.S., every other nation does the same thing that we do. They try to find other nations with whom they can work and give them an opportunity to participate in the work on the International Space Station, although they may not be able to do it. Africa is an example of where we have tried to have a special outreach. When we went to the International Astronautical Congress that was hosted in Cape Town, South Africa last year, I had the opportunity to meet with the heads of 5 African space agencies. You know, some people would say, really? And yes, really. Nigeria, Algeria, South Africa, there are nations in Africa who have an interest, a need for space programs, and have agencies that have been stood up. Almost every other nation in the world, the one thing we share is our interest in the Earth. And everybody's interested in remote sensing and Earth science. So that's probably the biggest area of collaboration for us, where we put our Earth science folk together with them, help them figure out what kind of instruments they want to develop, what do they want to use from us. Argentina, for example, we did a project called Aquarius SAC-D, and it is one of the most prolific, if you want to put it that way, satellites studying ocean salinities, you know, the salinity and oceans of the world. That was a collaboration between the United States and Argentina, with some partnership on the part of the Brazilians and other South American countries. But those kinds of things we do all the time.
I've heard it said in many occasions here at the council, on the record, that space is increasingly a domain that is congested and contested. What I hear you saying, and it's a great sense of encouragement, but that it's also a domain for cooperation and collaboration.
Ours is not, we are not in the business of competing with anybody, to be quite honest. Ours is trying to foster a sense of collaboration and cooperation. And there are some nations with whom we cannot work, but we know that our partners have the ability to do that. And so I think even there, you know, you find that almost any nation in the world that wants to come into the family of spacefaring nation and is willing to abide by the agreements that are made is welcome. There is an organization called UN Copious out of the United Nations, the United Nations Committee for Peaceful Uses of Outer Space. There are members of Copious that, you know, we don't deal with, but that doesn't mean anything. They are in an international collaborative, and as long as it's multinational, I don't think we have any restrictions over the kinds of things that we can do within reason. Yeah. We don't transfer technologies that are considered to be, you know, multi-use or dual use without some extensive clearance to do so. But other than that.
Well, Administrator Bolden, you can see from all the hands that are still going up, we could probably carry on this conversation for quite some time to come. But the council prides itself on beginning on time and ending on time. And you have been most gracious with your thoughts, your comments. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thanks so much.